You are very welcome to this really rude debunk video of Peter Zeihan. No, I'm joking. This is not a debunk video. And it's not a debunk video because it's very important that what we're going to do is engage in a kind of casual masterclass of ascription of epistemic credibility. This is going to be a video about you, actually, right? It's not going to be about Peter Zeihan getting something right, getting something wrong. It's going to be about you. And it's actually, in that sense, an advantage that I don't know Peter's work. I haven't read his books. And I've only watched 3 or 4 of his YouTube videos. And with those, it's illegal to disagree with him because the quality of raw nature behind him when he speaks is such that disagreement is simply not permitted. Now, who's this for? This is for my community. This is for you. If you're new, welcome. But know that you are so welcome, but you won't be the, as it were, target of this conversation. This is not going to be a conversation where I justify my responses in detail. I'm going to say plenty of just so things. So you're very, very welcome. But if you want to sort of ease into the community, go to the main channel first. This is our second channel. Watch some Polish content and then gently bring yourself back here for the casual conversations if you would like. Perspective and emphasis is really important here because, you know, there is a real tendency for many people to sit at a keyboard or by their device and think, oh my word, someone somewhere is really wrong about something important and I am going to type really fast and really hard to make sure they get to find out about all their mistakes. And that's pathological. The fact that someone is really wrong about something important means that you're alive and you're in a world of endlessly remarkable, beautiful human beings. And destructive and dark human beings too. But there's a serious point here. And that's that sometimes somebody's views matter beyond them if they are tied to a certain methodological approach, if they're tied to an institution, or if they're tied to a subject. And in that way, it's possible to say, doing a little counter attack on John Mearsheimer isn't just about John. It's about certain approaches to IR, and it might be indeed about IR theory altogether. And so discussing Mearsheimer may be interesting beyond Mearsheimer because there are analytical and theoretical tools, right, that stand and fall to some degree with him. And that's not necessarily the case, really, with Peter Zeihan, because what's going to fall if Peter gets something wrong? The enterprise of geopolitical consulting? No, it won't. I'm sorry, because he could then go ahead and get something right another time. So this is not a situation where we're going to agree that it's an emergency if Peter Zeihan makes a mess of his view of some process in the world, right? So having established all of this, let's be clear about what we're going to see. We're not going to see random bits of the podcast. I haven't seen the majority of the podcast. I only watched the Russian bits. And from the Russian bits, we're going to drop Peter's discussion of Russian propaganda. That was hilarious and apt. We're going to drop his discussion of nuclear risk. If you want to know my views of nuclear risk, go to the main channel and watch the latest video on nuclear risk there. And we are going to drop discussion of Putin's health. It seems maybe nothing serious, but it seems maybe a little something that going on with Peter historically health-wise. He seems to be a little on the ball about talking about health conditions. And we're not going to comment on that. We're just going to dive into the causes of war, of this war, primarily. So let's do it together now. And we are going to start.
And you felt like this is inevitable, and this is just something that was always going to happen, and it's not going to just stop at Ukraine.
No, not even remotely. The Russian space...
We're going to straight away say that different people sort of predicted the war for different reasons. And what the reasons were matters. So it's inappropriate to epistemically elevate somebody who said the war would happen over somebody who thought it might not, without getting into further detail. Go.
This is among the worst farmland in the world. And so they've never been able to generate enough income to have a road network. Everything has to be moved by rail. And their frontiers are just huge and they're open. And if you've got a force that can't maneuver itself, your only reasonable defense strategy is to be forward positioned and use geography to help you out. So you expand until you reach mountains or oceans or deserts, and then you anchor on either side of those and plug the access points.
And stop. So as you listen, right, and I'm listening with you, don't think, is this guy getting this right? Is this guy getting it wrong? Because think of what the underlying ideology is in pub speak, in more sophisticated speak, the sort of evaluatively laden content underneath what Peter is saying. Are there some international relations theory assumptions there about how the causation of state actions is supposed to work, right? What are these assumptions? Might they not be wonky? How are they structuring what's being said? Okay, go.
Unfortunately for Ukraine, there are two of those access points on the other side of Ukraine. So the Russians were always going to try to push through and retake that territory that they had controlled for most of the last 350 years.
And stop. Substantive flag here, but we'll return. Go.
Unfortunately for them, in the 35 years since the Soviet system collapsed, the Ukrainians have developed an identity. And now they would like to be something other than a road bump.
So one of the narratives that was going around was that the reason why Russia was pushing into Ukraine is because NATO was moving their arms closer to the border of Russia.
There is something to be said for that. You just have to put it into context to really understand it. So the Russian point of view is, for us to be secure, we need to expand until we reach a point where invaders cannot overwhelm us. We have to be able to plug those access points. But to give the Russians what they want, you have to sign over the future of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Finland, the Czech Republic, Hungary, Slovakia, Romania, Belarus,
so many
Ukraine.
Countries Joe must think he's smoking
let's
something.
go on. Azerbaijan, Armenia, Georgia, Kazakhstan, all the stands. Basically, the Russians, in order to feel safe, they have to be able to occupy total populations that are twice of their own. And I'm sorry, but that's just not feasible. So, technically, the people who claim that NATO provoked this are correct. NATO can't have what it wants in Russia in order for Russia to feel safe. But for Russia to feel safe, they've got to occupy over 180 million people.
Stop.
And that was never part of the game.
A substantive flag for now. And we're going to carry on. And I think Peter's going to make a couple of points now. And go.
Number one, the Russians are relatively casualty immune. They fight in an area where they fight with numbers. They've never been technologically advanced versus their peers. They've always just thrown bodies at it.
And
so there has never been a conflict in Russian history where they have backed out without first losing 500,000 men.
This is fair. Insofar as we can put a number on it, this is always going to be a facetious enterprise to go that way, but I'm comfortable to say that Putin's capacity for more casualties on the Russian side is far from exhausted, and the sort of ballpark Peter is talking about here, 500,000, is reasonable.
Piece two, the Russians see this as an existential fight for their survival. They feel if they don't get those blocking positions, they're doomed, and they're probably right. But we now know that the Russians are fighting so badly. They're doing much worse than the Iraqis did in 1992.
Really?
Oh, yeah. If we had a direct fight now between NATO and Russia, it would be 1,000-to-1 in casualties.
So 1,000-to-1 in casualties. It's very important to give people the benefit of the doubt when it comes to hyperbolic statement until you've clarified what their way of operating stylistically is. So my tendency is, when in doubt and encountering a hyperbolic statement, let it pass.
And I don't know anyone at the Defense Department who's happy about that. Because if the Russians see this as an existential conflict, and they know they can't hold a match to NATO, then nukes are their only option. So the primary reason why everyone in the West has gotten shoulder to shoulder on this is they know that if Ukraine falls and Poland's next, there will be a direct fight, the Russians will lose, and then there will be a general nuclear exchange. So there's plenty of really solid reasons to root for the Ukrainians on this one.
Jesus Christ.
Having planted already several flags, let's just say that up to a point, this is inescapably correct, that Ukraine was a frontier on a wider pattern of escalation. But whatever that pattern actually was needs to be discussed further, and we'll get to it. Go.
Now, when this whole thing broke out, what do you think the Russians expected Ukraine to just give up?
Absolutely. That's what happened in 2014 for the most part.
And what are the possible scenarios for Russia? I mean, if it seems like they're completely committed to this.
They are.
And if they don't win it?
The Russian position is that our demographic structure is in such diseased and aged and terminal decline that the Russian state will be turning the lights off sometime between 2050 and 2070 anyway.
Anyway.
Yeah.
And stop. Hyperbolic statement.
They've had a series of big melon scoops out of their birth rate throughout the history. World War I, World War II, the collectivizations under Stalin, Brezhnev's mismanagement, Khrushchev's mismanagement, the post-Cold War collapse. And a lot of these stack on top of each other. And the biggest one stacked on top of the post-Cold War collapse. So there are more Russians in their 50s than their 40s and their 30s and their 20s and their teens. And then they lie about the data of the teenagers on down. Which means that there aren't enough Russians that have been born in the last 30 years to carry the ethnicity forward much farther.
And stop. Now again, this is hyperbole that probably reaches a point where we can ask, what does this mean exactly? Carry the ethnicity forward.
And so they're thinking if they can forward position their military and plug those gaps now with their last generation of young people, then they can kind of die on their own terms 50 years from now.
Have they really thought about this in that term?
Yeah, this one way or another, this is the end of Russia. The question is whether it dies in the long term on their terms or in the shorter term when they're completely unmoored. Because if they fail to secure those borders, then they've got a 2,000-mile open border with countries they consider to be hostile, and they have no way of moving troops around in a way that would allow them to defend it. They'd just be waiting for somebody to come over and knock them over.
And you believe that they're aware of this, that they can't survive past 2050, 2070, right, whatever it is?
So Joe's pushed a bit, and instead of answering Joe's question about what's in the heads of these Russian leadership, Peter's restated what he said before, and now Joe is pressing it again. That's the underlying reality, but is that what the Russians are also thinking, right? And let's see.
I think that's what's been driving them, because 2022 was the last year where they had a sufficient number of people in their 20s to even attempt this. So from my point of view, not only did the war always have to happen, it always had to happen by now.
Jesus.
Okay, so we're going to stop and have a little break here. Now, let's be clear, first of all. Are we listening to somebody who gives the impression that they know a great deal about Russia? Yeah, by the standards of somebody at the best, of an enormous amount. What about by the standards of a Russia expert? What a Russia expert isn't a factual matter. Of course, this is an evaluative question, because what a Russian expert is inseparable from what a good Russia expert is. But no, I don't recognize that. And preliminarily, right, without pushing Peter too much into a corner, but a Russian expert probably answers these questions. Is that what they think? Joe says, and the answer should be, well, they don't think that, but that's why they don't think that, and that's what they really think, or what they think, and so on. And this is how Putin's thought has evolved, and this is where he is now, and this is where he was 4 years ago, this is where he was 12 years ago, and so on. Instead, right, Peter just returns with his geopolitical chessboard, and Joe's questions are not answered. So what is going wrong here? And again, this is not about giving a score out of 10 for Peter on this. This is about you coming to me and asking for my view, but it's also about us working through our sort of epistemic skills. Now let's look at something sociologically important. Now, that's that the majority of serious Russia experts would not be able to relate to what Peter is saying, and that's obviously a matter of alarm bells ringing, right? Your alarm bells should be ringing if that sociological fact is true, and it's true. Maybe it's not a fact, it's an evaluative judgment, but it's a kind of a sociological reality that most Russia experts begin with the thought that Putin got into this war out of considerations not about national security, but about regime security, right? And the way I render this for you, historically in our videos, is that we say, look, part of the reason for this war, very big part of the reasons for this war, is Putin feeling that it's a necessary defensive enterprise to avoid a situation whereby Russia, a few years from now, is wobbly, right? The regime is fragile, and at that point, Ukraine, on Russia's border, culturally a country of relative proximity to Russia, where Ukraine is independent and democratic, at that moment of fragility for the Putin regime, because that evokes in Putin images of Gaddafi and images of Saddam, because Ukraine could act as a platform that tilts this precarious situation in Russia against Putin's favor, and he wants to secure himself against that scenario, and he considers hypothetically Ukraine as a threat to his regime, as a threat to his life, right? And as a threat to Russian civilization that in his mind is tied to the will of a single individual, Putin. So sociologically this is interesting, right? But I'm also putting the epistemic foot down here too and saying that these matters of regime security, roughly construed as I've construed them, are driving, right, the war causally. But let's talk about the connected national security aspect here. Now, Peter is saying we've got a demographic crisis-mediated desire to plug a geographical hole for national security. Now, does the sociology improve here? Do these Russian experts wake up and say, now, oh, okay, this is sounding better? I don't think so. When I listen to this, it's not clear that I'm listening to somebody of comparable knowledge about Russia and the causes of Russian policy. And I'm not listening to a picture of causality that I recognize. Sure, there is a pattern of escalation there that goes far beyond Ukraine, and it's about challenging the West, challenging NATO, challenging Article 5, and there are hypothetical scenarios in which Russia has Ukraine, has Moldova, does a true build-up, let's say, on the border of the Baltic states, and takes things from there. But this is about shaking up the international order, exposing a weak response, a weakness of the West. It's going to respond with weakness because the Russian doctrine is that the West is now in irreversible decline. This decline, if it's real, which is to some extent real at the level of democracy, is nevertheless vastly exaggerated in the Kremlin. And then we're going to have a little reboot of the international order, right? So it's an escalation that anticipates a somewhat passive response from the West. But this isn't about demographic crises, and this is not about plugging holes. And moreover, there are mystical, quasi-mystical reasons for the war to do with Putin's civilizational turn, circa 2010 to 2014 and onwards. This is unavailable, right, through Peter's goggles, and certainly alarm bells have to ring. But I'm going to carry on. So, go.
What caused all this to be so poorly managed?
Well, Russia has always been poorly managed and authoritarian. But under Putin, it's taken a much darker turn because of the nature of the end of the Cold War. If you remember back to 1982, there was a coup in the Soviet Union. And Chernomyrdin and Andropov and Gorbachev were FSB, well, then KGB agents who basically overthrew the old system of Brezhnev and took over and because they're the only ones who really had a full understanding of what was going on. They controlled the information. They were not able to save the system, and so it broke.
Stop. Now, this is not hyperbole, but this is a kind of distance from historical concreteness that's really worth bringing out. I'm going to give Zeihan a pass here on Chernomyrdin. Chernomyrdin was certainly in politics at the time, but he was young. He wasn't even a minister of the gas industry yet, I don't think. He was about to get that position toward the middle of the 80s. And Chernomyrdin was later prime minister of Russia and I believe Russian ambassador to Ukraine. Peter gets a pass because he really means Chernenko, not Chernomyrdin, and it's a slip of the tongue, and we've got to be clear about that. But Chernenko and Gorbachev were KGB agents. Really? For real? Andropov was head of the KGB. And there was a coup. What kind of coup was there, Peter? Maybe Peter has a legitimate answer, but Brezhnev died. He wasn't overthrown. And there were then significant changes, of course, of various kinds of interesting stories there. Andropov and Gorbachev had a kind of unlikely relationship. Andropov met Gorby in the late 60s, and they had challenges and disagreements, but he had an eye on Gorbachev, or a positive kind of eye. Meanwhile, Gorbachev was exasperated by Andropov's incapacity to analyze the situation as it really was. But what Peter's coming out with here is something that an historian or a political analyst of an academic kind really wouldn't say, because this is a cartoonification that is really worth noting. Let's go on.
And Putin is the successor to that legacy because he was also in the KGB. And we're now in an environment that between the terminal demographic structure of the Soviet/Russian system and Putin's personal paranoia, so he's gone through and purged what was left of the KGB, FSB, of anyone who has personal ambitions to succeed him. We're left with an entire political elite of only about 130 people. And Putin has removed anyone who has leadership ambitions.
Oh, geez.
Now, they all see the world the same way. They all kind of agree with Putin on what's at stake here.
They all agree with what's at stake. That's unclear. I mean, how many people in Putin's Security Council would have started a full-scale invasion of Ukraine? Between 0 and less than a handful, perhaps? But where Peter is right is that Putin's actually marvelous at picking people. He's very good at picking people. But he only picks people who are profoundly corrupt and profoundly loyal, right? Which restricts the field. And to that extent, Peter is right. But then Peter goes on to say something that is, again, hyperbolic. that there are 130 people in this sort of elite, and that Sechin is the only one out of them who could ever do a revolution or a coup against Putin. But that if he did a coup against Putin, Peter says, then the rest of that elite would stop him or punish him afterwards, get rid of him afterwards. Now, that could be an okay sort of use of hyperbole, but of course, if you took that literally, that's just a silly statement that no serious Russian expert would make. And then he says later that Putin is in his mid-60s, which isn't true. But again, this is the sort of thing I would give him a pass for. So, where are we at together, putting this all together? I don't recognize significant friction with reality and causality in what Peter is describing, either when we look at matters of regime security, which are absent from Peter's discussion, at least here, or matters of national security. So let me just end by giving you a little snippet from a good Russian expert, Sam Greene. And Sam wrote this recently against Mearsheimer. And it says, folks like Mearsheimer don't seem to delve into any in-depth analysis of Russian politics or decision-making. Instead, they tend to project abstract assumptions about how states behave, derived from one iteration of international relations theory or another onto Russia, most of which came down to notions of national security. Those of us who actually do analyze Russia, however, tend to have a very different picture. And this is written not against Peter Zeihan, this is written against Mearsheimer. One in which the Kremlin is more interested in regime security than national security. There is this sociological fact sociological evaluative claim we've got to admit. As a result, because Putin's calculations vis-à-vis the war are fundamentally tied to domestic politics rather than international relations, the ability of anybody outside Russia, whether in Washington or Kiev, to entice him into a deal is vanishingly small. Might have Sam on the channel at some point. Thank you so much for watching, and have a lovely rest of the day. I hope this was of value to you. Bye-bye.